You see, when you fight a war, you do use lies. Churchill was the biggest liar. What is rather like a flywheel begins to spin. It's set in motion by the propaganda ministerium, by the propaganda officials, whatever they're called. In England, they were called the Political Warfare Executive, PWE. Some of our most important subsequent politicians, like Richard Crossman, were leading figures in PWE, and they set out the lies that persuade the soldiers that the war is worth fighting. And they create the war aims for the soldier. We British, we never had war aims, of course. We went into the war ostensibly because of Poland, but by 1939, by the end of that year, of course, that war aim had completely vanished. Poland had gone up the spout or down the tubes, whichever the way you care to look at it, and invaded from the east by the Russians, from the west by the Germans. Poland as such had ceased to exist. By the spring of 1940, really, the war had no further point. So Churchill, when he became Prime Minister, set up the big lie that the British Empire was endangered, that Hitler planned to attack the British Empire, that he was going to invade Britain, and then this made the war of great import for Britain. We had to fight, otherwise it meant perdition and oblivion for ourselves. Of course, the Americans weren't interested in preserving the British Empire, quite the opposite. We find out that President Roosevelt was saying in the spring of 1942 that his great dream and ambition is the destruction of the British Empire, beginning with India. He says that in a cabinet meeting in May 1942, and one of his secretaries of state, the vice president, in fact, Henry Wallace, wrote that down in his private diary. The destruction of the British Empire was the president's aim, and that man was our ally. How extraordinary. And yet we find at the same time now in the German papers, the secret German records of the time, and also pale reflections, pale echoes in the British papers, we find that at the same time Hitler was telling us, both before the war and during the war, right through 1940, indeed right through to May 1941, the famous mission of Rudolf Hess, Hitler was telling us that he had no aims against the British Empire at all. No desires, no wishes, no claim on the British, although we declared war on him. He wanted, in fact, the British Empire to remain as a great force for world civilization and stability. He said in private, as I know from his private staff, again and again, what point would there be for me to destroy Britain now or to attack London, the heart of the British Empire? If I destroy Britain, as I can, the only beneficiaries, the people who will make benefit from the British Empire will be the Americans and the Japanese. And what purpose have I got in wasting good European blood to benefit those two races? Again and again, he said both in private and through intermediaries to the British that he wanted to help the British Empire, even after the war had begun. He sent secret people across, he sent messages, he approached the ambassadors of the British in their various far-flung capitals and said, I make no claim on Britain or the British Empire. I am prepared to withdraw the German forces from Poland and Czechoslovakia, apart from the territories that, of course, the whole war was about in the first place, the former German territories that he had recovered. He was going to withdraw his armies from France. Of course, he wanted a free hand in the east, but why should that concern us? What concern had we to protect the peoples of the Ukraine or elsewhere in the east? This was entirely a matter, in my opinion, between Uncle Joe Stalin and Hitler. And if Hitler fell upon Uncle Joe Stalin, then as far as I'm concerned, it couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. But of course the trouble was that we were being told something completely different in England. We were told that Hitler was determined to destroy Britain and the British Empire. This was the great lie that Churchill set up, and it through until the end of 1941, when of course the Americans came in, who were not concerned with preserving the British Empire. In fact, they were quite frankly telling Churchill that we weren't going to get Hong Kong back, we weren't going to get Singapore back, we weren't going to get India back. None of this was going to be returned to us after the war. The Americans were bent on destroying it. So gradually and imperceptibly, a third war aim emerged, rather like two television pictures, one melting into the other. And by the end of the war aim has become fighting the devil incarnate, fighting the man who did all this. And all this, of course, we didn't know what it was at the time, but lo and behold, when we marched into Germany, we found what all this was. It was Bergen-Belsen, it was Dachau, it was Buchenwald, it was the awful pictures of bodies of emaciated, starved, infected people being bulldozed into lime-filled pits by British Army bulldozers in the concentration camps. Of course, nobody claimed that this kind of starvation, this kind of killing or death on this scale had been going on throughout the war in those camps, but this was the picture that was put to the British in the newsreels, in the cinemas, in the newspapers. Vivid, ghastly pictures, which seemed to justify, in retrospect, by their sheer bedazzlement, the war that we had fought. Suddenly, it all seemed worthwhile because we saw what had been going on in Germany. And nobody asked logical questions like, surely all this kind of death on this scale only happened in the last 2 or 3 weeks. Or, if people died of typhus and starvation in Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald, then possibly weren't we British and Americans partly responsible because we deliberately produced the chaos and the conditions behind the German lines that led to starvation and typhus epidemics, because we deliberately bombed the pharmaceutical factories, we bombed the bridges, the railroad lines, the autobahns, to prevent the transportation of food from one part of Germany to another. But of course, those are logical questions, and in the heat of an aftermath of a bloody war, you don't ask logical questions. You're out for revenge.